It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wilmore Webley. Dr. Webley is a professor of microbiology and the Senior Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Webley will be discussing tonight COVID-19 vaccine updates. Dr. Webley, the floor is yours.
It's good to be with all of you. And I was going to talk with you a little bit about COVID. So I'll jump into COVID again. Same issue that each time we have a variation in the COVID, it's constantly changing. The vaccines that we have don't work as well. I saw this diagram, publication just recently came out in Nature Medicine. And what it's showing, it is showing the cognitive deficits that are caused by COVID. And the headline here is really interesting. The cognitive deficits they're seeing in patients that require hospitalization is of a magnitude that's 20 years of aging over the 1 year period that they looked at these patients who were suffering from long COVID. So they normed it based on people who didn't have COVID, and then they had people who had COVID. And what you saw was that this global deviation from expected score, this composite score, dropped. In other words, these are scores based on these specific markers that they're looking at that tells you if people are cognitively reduced in any way. And what they're seeing is that they're seeing ongoing injury in the gray matter. They're seeing other inflammatory injuries, but this neuro COVID, these are people who had the most severe COVID infections, and they're seeing a significant drop in cognitive abilities in these individuals, and they're seeing changes in the brain of these patients. So again, COVID continues to be a significant issue, and you can look and you can see tau proteins, you're seeing neurofibrillary tangles, you're seeing that increased overall in these patients. Pretty much what you're seeing in dementia and aging is what you're seeing in these patients. This is looking at a 3-year outcome of post-acute sequelae for long COVID. And what it's showing is these are people who are hospitalized and non-hospitalized. And even for people who weren't hospitalized, their chances, their cumulative excess death risk increased for a year and then leveled off and dropped. But for people who were hospitalized over a 3-year period, their likelihood of death continued to increase. This is from having long COVID, right? What the data showed overall is that for every major organ system infected here, you can see for people who were hospitalized in red, you can see the risk of cardiovascular coagulation type diseases, kidney diseases, all of these went up over time. And even for people who weren't hospitalized, you can see increases. And for pulmonary, there's a persistent increase that just kept going up, even for people who were not hospitalized overall. And you keep seeing this for cardiovascular disease. See that? Risk goes up. And then interestingly, what they saw was that for people with long COVID, their risk for Alzheimer's was significantly increased. And this is after following people up for a year to 3 years. So again, this is a significant issue that I think we're going to continue dealing with. And with the low vaccination rate that we're seeing, it's not helping at all. More and more vulnerable people are getting infected and are having long COVID. What we know is for people who are immunocompromised, they shed the virus for way longer. People who are HIV positive, people with autoimmune diseases, they're shedding viruses for way longer periods than people knew initially. And that is contributing to some of the inflammation that they're experiencing. So the COVID vaccines have been very effective in preventing long COVID and preventing hospitalizations and severe diseases. And that's true for the Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen that we don't use anymore, of course, the Novavax vaccine. You can see the effectiveness of these vaccines overall, of course, with the challenges of side effects that we're seeing. And this summary is really saying that for the new iterations of the COVID vaccine against the XBB strains and subvariants, that has actually reduced symptomology significantly in people, 7.2 million symptom reduction, hospitalization reduction by over 300 and something thousand, over 50,000 deaths prevented because of these vaccines. And this is over the 1 year period compared to people who didn't get vaccinated And this is the Moderna vaccine they're looking at with no additional vaccine. But same thing for the Pfizer vaccine, that you're seeing a significant reduction. And that is leading to savings, cost savings for hospitalization in the billions or multi-millions of dollars. So again, the vaccines have worked. But what we've seen over time is that we've seen this dramatic change in the different COVID variants that we're seeing. And this is from NextStrain, for those of you who are interested in genetics and the genomics of the virus, looking from the earlier stage coming over, you can see the changes in both the geography as well as the genetic makeup of these viruses, from your alpha, your beta, your lambda going on. And then from there, jump into your BA1 strains. You can see that populating there. Your BA2 strain is that bluish purple that you're seeing. The gray there is all the others. And that's when Delta was making its move. And then, of course, you moved into the Omicron age where XBB started popping up. Your BA2 variants started coming in and causing problems. And so over time, you can see that as these changes occur, vaccines don't work as well as they used to, right? And so essentially that causes significant problems, because while the vaccines will work to some extent for people who are most vulnerable, you're not going to have the level of protection that's going to significantly reduce your symptoms. You might still end up in the hospital. So you keep having to up these. And now we're in the stage where you had your KP variants, where the last vaccine update was made against. But by the time that came around, of course, you start having your new variants, your XEC variant, which is what we're seeing now taking over. It's right here. Your KP3 variant was the last big push that we had. And you can see this is all over the place. The Novavax vaccine is a little bit different. It's the protein vaccine made in insect cells through a baculovirus system. So it's a protein. The rest here, Moderna and Pfizer, are mRNA vaccines where the transcript is given in a lipid nanoparticle, and we actually make the protein inside of the body from it. And then, of course, you had your DNA-based virus, AstraZeneca. Janssen was the same thing. This is a viral vector vaccine where you use a virus to bring the S protein in, the spike protein in, so that you can make it overall. So essentially, the idea is that you put in the transcript of the mRNA, then you get the protein. That protein now gets taken up by immune cells, and you have an immune response, B cell, T cell response overall. For the protein-based, it's different. You have to make that protein. You have to purify that protein from the insect cells. You're linking it with this plant-based adjuvant to induce that strong immune response, because, of course, that's the problem with subunit vaccines, that you are putting in a piece of protein and the body might not pay it much attention. So you need an adjuvant, something to drive the immune response, and that's how the saponin comes in. And so that you now have a strong antibody response. And so this is the Novavax vaccine, and it does a very good job. You actually have a really good protection from the Novavax vaccine. So what have they been looking at? Lots of different vaccines are in development still. People are still looking at an inactivated vaccine that they think would be better, a whole virus vaccine. Of course, the concern there is making sure that you actually inactivate everything. Others are looking at an attenuated strain of the vaccine, similar to others that have been made. But again, overall, the efficacy of the vaccines that we've been looking at have been pretty good. How do we now keep that going with an overall vaccine setup that doesn't change as often? So this recent paper came out, and Kevin actually shared this with me, where the authors posit that because they're missing these long-lived plasma cells in individuals who have been immunized, that's why you're not actually having the long-lived immunity. And I had two responses to that, that the seasonal coronaviruses that we have, that nobody's making a vaccine against, the reason that they're seasonal, they're not really changing much. They're coming back in the same form, and we are not able to make long-lived immunity to them. They still infect us in a similar way. So there's no natural immunity there that's actually giving you long-lived protection. The other thing is the spatial arrangement, which they blame, that's what they're showing here, that an IgG antibody is not able to bridge these to give you the type of immune response. I disagree with, because essentially you don't need that. What you need is the condition within the bone marrow, which is where long-lived plasma cells live, You need a niche, you need good cytokines and chemokines to be produced there to keep those plasma cells going. And what they weren't able to test, they weren't able to see if those long-lived plasma cells were made in the first place and then just didn't continue living because they weren't supported by the bone marrow niche, which is what most people suspect. And so Pamela from California Institute of Technology, who has been building this nanoparticle COVID-19 vaccine, she basically said influenza virus has tightly spaced surface proteins, and yet you don't have durable immunity. So something else might be going on there. But suffice it to say, people are looking at this. So at this point in time, the vaccines that we have for COVID-19 are your KP2 strain and your JN1 for Novavax, because they don't churn out vaccines as quickly. They weren't able to catch up on this strain because the JN1 strain is a previous strain, the time when they started building, but of course it takes long for them to build their vaccine. But Moderna and Pfizer were able to protein the KP strain, which is a more recent strain variant that dominated. All of these vaccines give pretty good protection overall, which we're still lucky for. So here are some updated things that are happening in the vaccine space for COVID-19. That again, BARDA is funding Vaxart to actually produce an adenovirus-based vaccine, a spike protein vaccine, that they believe could be more effective. This is going to be in a pill base, it's going to be an oral vaccine, which they believe will not have the type of inflammatory responses that we're getting from these mRNA vaccines that people have been pushing back against. And then, of course, the Castle Vax, they're looking to make a vaccine that's a mucosal, that gives a mucosal response, a respiratory mucosal response. And they're actually in phase 2B trial right now. They've been funded for this and they're moving ahead. So these are two important ones to watch. Also, there's another mucosal vaccine also in phase 2, the PIV, and another one also looking at a stronger immune response against the spike protein. So they are doing some things to actually get this going. But essentially, in order to have a strong vaccine, you need something that's variant proof. If you're going to have a universal COVID vaccine, you need vaccines that protect against a wide range of the sub-level of SARS-CoV-2 beta coronaviruses. And you also need something that protects against all of your coronaviruses, your original SARS, your current one, and possibly any new one that might emerge or re-emerge over time. And I'll essentially stop there so that we can take a few questions if you have time to do that.
Thank you very much for a very interesting, informative, and important presentation.